everybody. Welcome back. Little Bit of Life podcast right here with your host, Little. As promised, this was not only just a part one, but we have a part two because there's so many different aspects to this case, to the name, to the story, and everything else. So I have not one, but two guests on today. I have Sam back with us, and I also have on Arvis Owens. We are deep diving into the military, injustice, and everything in between. Hey, Sam, how's it going? It's good to see you again.
It's good. It's good to see you again, Tabitha. How are you?
Good. So, for those that may not have listened to the episode on Tuesday, give us a little bit of a quick backstory of why you came on to share not only your story for one seasons, but two different episodes.
There's definitely not any quick version of this story, but I'll try my best. My name is Sam. I was a 15-year veteran of the United States Army and Special Forces, and I spent almost 3 years in prison due to some false allegations from my wife, ex-wife, during a divorce dispute over a house. And even though there was no basis to our allegations at all, I was found guilty. I had a lot of evidence that would have helped me that I wasn't able to share. But before we go any further, Tabitha, I do want to say thank you so much for having me on and having Arvis on. I'm so appreciative that you're talking about this because this is something that nobody else is talking about. I tried so hard to get anybody else in the media to be interested in this, and nobody will talk about it. So I want to say, first and foremost, thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on to share your story. The sad part is that we are going to deep dive in with you and Arvis. Is this is happening to so many in the military? It's not happening just to men, so I want that to be very clear for listeners. It's happening to both women and men. But I think it is the lack of the missing pieces that the military is not advocating for you. They're actually advocating against you, which brings me to introduce Arvis Owens. You have been on plenty. We've had a lot of conversations. Good to see you. How are you?
It's great to see you, and thanks again for having me back. I'm good.
You have a history. You have an emotional connection to all of the advocacy, all of the hard work that you're doing for the families. And it's because you have been in very similar shoes. Give us a little bit of a backstory on what has put you now to helping advocate and be the voice for many families and individuals such as Sam.
Okay. So, Naval Academy graduate from Beaumont, Texas, was active duty Navy myself, and then I was falsely accused. I did everything possible I could to fight the charges. Um, Unfortunately, I was found guilty, but the same jury that convicted me came back during sentencing and asked to reverse the guilty verdict, but they weren't allowed. And when I tried to get media help and attention, there was none. And then I realized there were so many people just like me. And I figured if I don't help, then no one will. And so that's how I became an advocate. And I advocate for the falsely accused and wrongly convicted.
You got to have some strong shoulders to carry that weight. Not only are you advocating for families, but you're getting really in the personal lives, such as Sam. We had Sam's partner at the time. She was on with us and with you and I. We did a two-part series as well. But I really wanted to do two separate episodes because the first was really truly Sam's story and giving us all the information that we needed to get. I think as society, we're so interested in fighting for a cause and really standing up for what is right versus wrong. But there's still that sense of, I need more information. I want to know all the nitty gritty information before I really step up and step out. And I think that's truly why we need to do this for so many military. It's because in order to advocate, we need to be able to hear like Sam's story and the truth behind what happened and the flaws and the missing pieces within the military. So, especially for Sam during the court hearing and everything, like, did you feel that you were really supported by the military or did you just feel like you were out there on your own?
No, I wasn't supported at all. And so, one of the things that's different about the military system from the civilian system is when there's any kind of investigation done in the civilian system, the goal is to find out what the truth is. And the investigators aren't invested in whether or not it's A or it's B. But in the Army, and I do want to say that I'm going to speak specifically about the Army because that's what I know. But in the Army, what they're trying to do is find the best way for the Army to win. So they're not necessarily looking for the truth, they're looking for a way to win. And so that's probably the first thing that I want people to understand. And when you have a force like that against you, I mean, you can feel pretty scared and pretty alone. And they do assign you a lawyer, but it's an overworked, brand new lawyer who definitely is struggling. I ended up having to hire a defense attorney. It cost $20,000, which was a huge financial burden for me. The biggest thing that was hard for me was just the lack of support for the family. And throughout this process, just the lack of concern for my children and their mother. And so I would say that has been the most disappointing thing for me, because I understand I signed up for this, but they didn't. And I think that's just the point that I want people to think about, is can relate to what it would be like to have their family members in this type of situation, where they just have a force like the United States government against them instead of helping them, and how just unbelievably stressful that was at all times.
Mhm. For those that have listened to the episode that aired on Tuesday with part one, we were able to get, like I said in the disclaimer, we were able to get all of the audio that you even talk about. Because, like we said in episode one, it seems unfathomable to believe the things that were said to you, the names that you were called. It was a domestic violence situation. When we think as a society, domestic violence, we always pair that with the victim being a female. And we talked about that in the first episode. And not only that, but only 8%, that is such a small number when you look at stats. 8% of men are reporting domestic violence situations in the military. Only 8%. And I think that the more that we do this and the more we talk about it and really truly educate, it is because of all the men that are scared. What is this going to do to my career? What is this going to do to my family? And it's something where we never imagined this was a thing that was happening in the military. And it's happening more than we really like to admit. Arvis, do you see this happening more with men that are almost being halted not to report or say anything because of threats, because of their career, the loss of all the hard work and honorable things that they've done in the military?
Tabitha, that's exactly right. In fact, I believe it was touched on in the first episode that Sam actually tried to come forward and he was advised against it because it would hurt his career. Others have had the same thing. It's, as a society, we don't want to think of women as aggressors. And in a macho environment, it puts a negative light. I think things like the Johnny Depp trial brought things up to the forefront, but in the military, it's still a little bit of an older system. So Sam, there's so many men like Sam in all of the services that his case doesn't surprise me. It saddens me, but it doesn't surprise me because there's so many men like him. And you're 100% right. There's a stigma attached to men showing weakness and coming
Mhm. Going into talking about those recordings, because Sam, like you and I discussed in that very first episode, you were encouraged by the legal counsel that you had to record these events.
Right.
Which brings me to the question, were those played in its entirety in court? Because when you have a domestic violence situation, just like Arvis said in the Johnny Depp trial, those were wide open in the media for everyone to hear in its entirety, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. Was this something that was equally important to be heard in the courtroom in the military court system for you?
I don't want to turn this into a legal podcast, but the big difference was that the Johnny Depp trial was a civil suit. So there's entirely different rules of evidence, even though it was in the civilian system, but it was also a civil suit, not a criminal suit. So in a criminal suit, there are rules of evidence, and the military has their own rules of evidence. So the military rules of evidence, and because of those rules of evidence, we were not allowed to play any of those recordings because weren't they were held to be not to have anything to do with the accusations. Is basically how they determined that. So the jury didn't hear any of those recordings, like not a single word of one of them, and we were able to discuss them a little bit, but anything that we would get into at all will result in an objection. That's, like I say, that's the biggest thing to remember. It's like the Johnny Depp case, unfortunately, it's an apples to oranges comparison, so we weren't able to do that.
Mhm. Arvis, do you see this a lot in the military system where certain things are allowed when it helps the case versus things that are excluded for their reason of choice?
very much so. In fact, if I can give you a few examples, we have a case where the accuser is on video admitting that she lied. She was in danger of being kicked out for PT failures. The local law enforcement had that video. There was a government agent in the room. So they dropped the case. The civilians dropped the case. A year later, the military picked it up and they would not allow the video and they would not allow the agent to testify. He was convicted. Another story, a man gets a recording of his wife's lover, military man, who admitted he lied in military court and that he got a $10,000 payment. But because he's a civilian, the military has no jurisdiction to go after him for perjury. So they have a hearing where he admits the 10,000 was one installment. He got $100,000. We have people who've got voice recordings, video evidence that were not allowed. We have a member he was falsely accused, and she had falsely accused 5 others, and he wasn't allowed to bring that evidence in a trial. And my last example is a man, Air Force Robert Andrew Condon, who was an agent himself. And every bit of the evidence supported him, including the investigation and the nurse. And he received 30 years as an example, and they've denied him parole. His mother, who's law enforcement, retired, hired 2 civilian investigators who came forward. And it turned out that his accuser had fraudulently enlisted in the military, but the military withheld that from him until after his case was over, and he could not use it because it never showed up in court. Things like that happen all of the time. Sam is unfortunately not a rarity, right? Is we have many cases just like this. And I'll give you one last example. I like to call the kissing candy bar. We had a lady who was married. She told her husband she was going out for a candy bar. Instead, she goes to a bar and does shots. She, in front of this soldier's friends, asked him to go back to his barracks rooms to quote unquote have a little fun. He goes back, they go back, she drives, they have unprotected sex. Now she has 4 children. So she calls the hospital and says, I need a plan B. And they said, were you a victim of rape? They had to ask her multiple times. And then she finally agreed, but she didn't want to press charges. There was video evidence at the bar, testimony that was not allowed. And that young man received 20 years in prison, Anthony Santucci. And there's no parole, there's no training. And so there's all of this evidence that the military can pick and choose. And if I can make this one last parallel, they were pressured to do, there was a belief that the military wasn't doing enough, so they were pressured to get convictions, regardless of what the evidence was. And that's our biggest problem.
We talked about that last year. I can't believe it's already been a full year that we talked about Sam's story. And that's why I really was adamant to get him on again to tell his story. I think it's important to go through that because it's something where so many individuals just think, you're in the military, you're protected. You're wearing the uniform, you're protected. You have given your life to this country and they want to protect you at all costs. And that's really not the way that it is. So, Sam, we talked about in the first episode what it's like being out. And you're very much, I want everyone to understand, you're still in the fight or flight mode. You're still living with that label, but you're in that appeal process. So explain to listeners and myself, we're here for education. What does the appeal process look like, both you and Arvis? Because you can't obviously do this alone.
Yeah, so the appeal process, and this is complete coincidence, but I actually spoke with my attorney today, and I just wanted to touch bases with them. And we've been waiting. It made it to the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, the first level. It made it there in the middle of February. And what he told me was, we have no idea. He said, we could hear next week, we could hear next year. He said, I didn't think it would take this long, but with that said, there's absolutely no way to know. And so that's such a crazy process to be in, to know I'm going to get an email one day, and I don't know how I'm going to be able to open up the email. I can't even imagine. I think I'm just going to pass out when I see who it's from. But so that's been really intense to know that whether or not I'm a felon, whether or not I'm on the sex offender registry, is all based on whether or not that whatever this ruling is from the judges. And it's so frustrating because I know you and I talking right now, like I'm the exact same person, but tomorrow I might be off the registry. Today I'm on it, tomorrow I might be off of it. And it's just based on whatever this email says. And that's really frustrating. But that's a society wide issue as well. And that's the biggest thing. It's like this could just happen to anybody. And that's what's really scary about it. It's like you get yourself into a bad relationship, which I did. It ends up into a bad divorce and it goes in this direction. And the military makes this a tool that people can use if they're having a dispute over something like a house. And she wasn't thinking about the long-term repercussions for me and for my family. It was just a tool that she used. So it was a tool that was there, so she used it.
I think it's scary to think of how you said that in the beginning. This can happen to anybody, but the military is using this as a tool. I always think of, even we're raised very young, right from wrong, the boy who cried wolf. And it's a main cause of concern now, seeing that this is a tool that is being handed out by the military to use. Of, if you're in a sticky situation and you're with somebody that maybe you find that you're not on the uphill of winning what your personal battle is, throw this out there and use it, stick it to the wall, and we'll make sure that it stays.
Right.
I think that is so detrimental to bring attention, because it's the boy who cried wolf. What really happens when this is happening, either to a male or to a female? How is that going to play out versus those that are wrongfully convicted and it was used against them when it didn't even have to be? Arvis, for the appeal process, it's probably a very interesting question to be asked based on what you do in advocating. But for those who may be completely new to this happening, what does the appeal process look like for evidence? Do they look over everything from the initial trial? Do they allow new evidence? What chance is that for someone like Sam?
They don't allow new evidence. Like I said, in that one case, the military withheld her fraudulent enlistment until after, so he could not introduce it for the appeal process. There
Right.
used to be a process where the convening authority, the general officer, the senior leader who brought the case, could actually withdraw the charges. But then Congress changed that for sex assaults only because they didn't want them intervening. So then each of the services has an appellate court. Army, Navy, Air Force, of course, the Marine Corps goes to the one at the Navy. And so, three-judge panel, they could overturn the cases, but they're pressured as well. And then after, you have the Court of the Armed Forces, CAF, which is like the military equivalent of the Supreme Court. And they overturn very few cases. And of course, the Supreme Court won't most likely even take a military case, but every now and then they will. For instance, in the military, there's no unanimous juries. And in the military, the person who brought the charges picks your jury. So and that jury could look any way they choose. And there is pressure because when you've been handpicked to be on that, you know why you're on that. And regardless of the evidence you have, things are not going to go your way. And I wanted to add something to what Sam said. I want the American people, I want your listeners to imagine how they would feel if it happened to someone they love. This could happen to you, someone you love, someone you care about, and say, not only is it being used as a weapon in contentious relationships, but it's used as a get out of jail free card, because the military will forgive what they
Mhm.
call collateral misconduct. So let's say you're in trouble yourself. If you become a victim, all is forgiven. If you want to transfer to a new duty station, all is forgiven and you can do that. If you want to receive extra money in veterans benefits, you can get that. There's even a program in the military called Catch. So someone could make a restricted report against someone, which means there's no investigation, no one knows. They don't even get informed of it. It stays in their record for 10 years. And what they're doing is they keep it, so if another investigation comes forward, they contact the other person and says, "Hey, do you want to come forward with this other person?" So they can try and build a case against you. So the system is 100% geared to get an outcome. Sam is correct.
Right.
They want to win. And so for the American public, this could happen to you. This could happen to your child. I want you to imagine strongly it happening to someone you love. And then my last point is, I'm going to tell you why it's not making you safer. Is because if the military is allowed to keep cases like Sam, other cases like this, then who's going to be attracted to join? How can a parent support their kid joining? And are you going to be safe? Are you really attracting the best and brightest? And so if you allow something like this to go on, then we will no longer be the home of the free.
I think that's why we're seeing an enlistment rate dropping at rapid rates. That's why my email inbox is always flooding with people and families saying, help us. I think it's also why, like when Sam said, nobody wants to take these stories, nobody's talking about this. And I think it's a fear of not being educated enough, because for civilians, we've been almost trained of, if it has to do with the military, the government, it's hands off. Whatever they say is a green light, let it be. Because I think when these kind of things happen, it's so many people on the civilian side think you are going against the government. When you even say that out loud, one, you and I have talked about it. It's this sense of fear. It's the sense of, am I doing something wrong? But when Sam and I talked in, especially his first episode, it is the difference between right and wrong. There still has to be accountability in the justice system. And when you look at all of these families that are being affected, like with Sam, for instance, your children are so affected by this, their mother, your parents, everyone that surrounds you, it does not just affect the soldier that is being wrongfully accused, convicted. It affects the entire community. Arvis, you and I have talked about this, especially with those wrongfully convicted that are on the registry, such as Sam, sometimes for the rest of their lives. This is so impactful. It is not just a simple label, but it comes with so many other things. And we've talked about mental health a lot on my podcast and on this platform. And I think it's something to really focus on because, Sam, you're very open, you're very vulnerable on all of your platforms. You're still going through this, even though you did the time that the military stated that was a requirement. How has this affected your mental health and how has this affected where you are now? Because you're still stuck in it with the appeal process.
And I mean, I am very open about this with everybody I talk about, but like I would say mental health is probably like the number one issue I deal with. It's an everyday thing. And so just the unbelievable stigma with the sex offender registry, and then all of this really on top of the just the abuse itself. Because even if I hadn't gone to prison, I would still have that to deal with. And it's honestly, it's everybody likes to talk about gaslighting right now, but it's the ultimate gaslight to try to report or try to talk to people about having been abused, but to be told that you're the abuser by the entire society. And it's like you've said and Arvis has said, just nobody wants to talk about this issue. They just absolutely don't want to talk about it. It's not, I guess it's not a soundbite issue. I think that's some of it, but it's Arvis has already hit on it. It's just something that it can happen to anybody. And I get really frustrated sometimes because I think I'm not the first person to have gotten into a bad marriage. And I'm not the first person to have chosen a bad partner and then tried to get out of that relationship. So it's just this sense of unfairness of why did it happen to me? But then that just highlights the fact that it could happen to me, it could happen to anybody. And I just can't say that enough. It is something that people need to take pause. And when their children are thinking about joining the military, it's something that it's going to be in the back of their mind. It would have to be. And are they going to be safe there? And so it's just something I want people to think about.
I've always said this on the platform last year, this year, almost every episode I do that involves anything that's between right and wrong. The louder that we are as a community, the more we start talking about these topics of conversations. These seem to be taboo. When you talk about domestic violence, then you join that with the military, then you join that with the title or the label of wrongful convictions. Those three do not go together in the vision and view of society. When you talk domestic violence, it's, oh, were you the victim? We'll help you. Oh, were you the perpetrator? I'm out.
Right.
When you talk about the military now, there's this shift level that's happening because of situations like this in the justice system. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to touch it. They're scared. There's all kinds of things combined. Then when you even use the term, I've done it. It's interesting. I always do polls and interactions and things like that on the podcast. And when I do anything in regards to wrongfully convicted, it is complete and utter cricket
Yeah.
silence.
Yeah.
No one knows how to react to those words. I don't know if it's a lack of education. Again, I don't know if it's a lack of fear or it's something where if it didn't happen to me, I have no options to get involved in this. So that's why we're doing this episode because Arvis, I think it's very important. You now advocate, you do this for a living, you have multiple families, you're helping so many people. And I always say we can be really loud as one individual person, but like Sam, you coming on and being vulnerable and telling your story, you're going to have a magnitude of men that may say, this happened to me and I had no chance. I had nowhere to go, no one to believe me before, during, or after. And that's why we talk mental health, because a lot of the individuals that this happens to, it's just too much. They can't do it. They can't handle it. They can't manage and they can't make it. So, Arvis, what are you doing within your advocacy to help families? Is there anything that can be done?
100%. So, one thing that your listeners can do is we have a petition, www.change.org/unjust UCMJ. They can sign that, they can share it to bring attention to this. They can take your show and send it to everybody they know and everybody they don't know. politicians, the military, and spread it. And before I continue, I want to thank you again, just as Sam did. And I want to give your listeners just a snapshot of the courage that you have. Is when before we started coming on, when Tabitha was doing her homework and her research, she went to 10 friends and family members to look into this, to do a deep dive. And all 10 confirmed that this was happening in the military. But all 10 of them told her, do not do this show. Do not go after the military. They will come after you. Do not do this. And she had the courage to do it anyway. She had the courage and the fortitude. And I can't tell you enough how grateful we are that she's there. So to answer your question, we tell them about counseling. We profile members like Sam who have the courage to come forward. Sam, thank you for being vulnerable enough to share your story, because it encourages a lot of people to come forward. If someone was in the special forces and they have this issue, then think about a common soldier or sailor, airman, or Marine. And so they have the courage to come forward. We can try and find them help and resources. And to go back with the mental health, there's suicide risk that you wouldn't believe. There's a homelessness risk that you wouldn't believe. And it impacts generations. It is so incredibly terrible, the mental aspect. So imagine you've got people who've got combat fatigue and PTSD, and you wrap up the false allegation system with that and everything that comes after that. And again, for your listeners, imagine at your job, someone who's on the registry applies. Are you going to hire them, right? Are you going to take the time, and are you going to hire them? Are you going to bring them in? Be honest with yourself and think that's one major aspect of all of this and the impact it has on them. Like I said, we advise as best we can. We encourage people to be strong, but there is a depression that you would not believe. And sadly, many people do things that we would rather not see them do, with substance abuse and suicide. But we do our best to advocate for them, to put their stories out front and show them that you are not alone, that we care about you, that we're going to continue putting pressure. So please share this show with everyone, and even the people you don't, and encourage them to do the same. And that's what you can do to help.
I always, as he said, I always do the deep dive. I always do my homework. It's something where I do turn down multiple people that want to come on as a guest and share their story, only because if I'm standing behind something, I'm not ever standing behind you or in front of you. I'm standing right with you. When I heard this story last year, it was just a hands down. I knew I had to do it. It's the difference between right and wrong. And it was interesting because even Sam, you and I doing your episode and recording for the Tuesdays drop, it's so different feeling that you know someone without knowing them. Just because you know their story, you're told their story from another perspective. Last year, I was told from Arvis and the guest that was on with us your story. And it was so difficult because I think as humans, we want to fight and advocate for change when we feel an emotional tie to something. And we know that, hey, you know what? If this happened to me, I'm one of those people, I'm an empath. I love to put myself in other people's shoes. And I think that the more that people listen, especially to your story, like Arvis said, imagine that this could happen to anyone. It could, even if you're in the military and you're listening to this going, I'm so proud of my country. I'm so proud of the branch that I'm in. It can happen to anyone. And if you're listening, imagine what would you do in that situation? Sam, I have to thank you for being vulnerable, not only last year and getting all the information to me through Arvis, but even now, because even though you're on the outside, like what you said on your first episode, it's almost easier to just be there because you don't know where you fit, how life looks, what you're going to do next. You're in this appeal process. You're walking around with this giant cloud over your head. Like you said, you're waiting on an email. You were inside waiting to get out, just do your time, and you're processing what you needed to. But now that you're outside, it's this constant, when am I going to get that?
Yeah.
And I think that's so unfair from the military. I truly do. I know appeals take a very long time in any form of a case, but I think you've already gone through so much. And it's so scary to sit and think the words of one individual can change the direction of your life for the rest of your life, all because they need to make sure that they are right no matter what.
I was just going to say this to add. I forgot to add this when you talked about the appellate process. In every state in the United States, there is either a conviction integrity unit or an innocence project. So think outside of the courts. who you see them in the news periodically where you go, this person was falsely accused and convicted and spent 20 years in prison, 30 years in prison, and the evidence was there. So every state and territory of the United States has that support except the United States military. And I would direct your listeners to the audit done by DOD financially and the billions that they couldn't find. So imagine a conviction interrogator unit that does an audit on this system. And the question is, how would they ever recover from it? Is how would the American people trust them when you see the flag, if you know this is happening and they don't have the courage to reverse these cases, to look at these cases, how could you ever trust them? I really want you to think about that and ask other people that hard questions. Ask the military those hard questions. Show them the video. Show them these videos and ask. I would tell you this, Tabitha, we got calls from parents who had your videos and showed them to recruiters and they couldn't speak. They left the room, right? We're okay with challenging the status quo, and that's what it takes. People willing to speak up before it happens to you.
Mm-hmm. For those listeners that may be sitting here, because I know I play both sides here, I'm the devil's advocate in the middle. What is the success rate of these turnovers in the appeal in the military system? Is it even something that's we're starting to see a change, or it's very minimal?
I will tell you, there has been a couple of small changes. For instance, they've taken the convening authority out of the jury selection process. They've said, you're right, that's not fair. But what about all the cases that came before? There was a time in the military where if the person had one alcoholic beverage, you couldn't consent. So you were guilty. Guess what? Okay, we're not going to do that anymore. But what about the hundreds of cases that came before you made that change? I would tell you couldn't get the mental health history of your accuser before. But they're starting to do that now. And people are attacking that. They don't want to allow you access. But what about the cases before where you didn't allow it? So here's the thing I will say to my listeners. We 100% support true survivors and true victims. We 100% support them. We believe there should be an investigation, but the evidence should be paramount in that decision process. And so what we would say is now they're starting to look at the mental health history. And the question I ask is, if someone makes a false accusation, what are the odds they have mental health issues, right? Just think about that for a second. There's no statistics I can give you, but what are the odds that they have a mental health history? And I'm not saying that people who have mental health cannot be the victim of abuse or sexual assault or rape. I am just saying of the microcosm that are false accusers, what are the odds they have it? And so they're starting to look at that. But whenever they can, they want to suppress that. So they're making minuscule changes to the system, but there is still a lot of pressure to get convictions. And so we want complete transparency. We want there to be accountability. We want them to fix the system so that your son, your uncle, your cousin, your friend, your father is safe. And I will tell you, one of the changes involves sexual harassment, which is something that went back. Let's say you're cracking a joke and the door is closed and you use a colorful word to say, for lack of a better term, and someone on the other side of the door hears it, they can say you sexually harassed them. And then that's a court-martial offense. The other thing that they haven't fixed is there's something called titling with the military. So with civilians, you get titled, which means you go to the FBI database for 40 years upon conviction. With the military, it's when they start an investigation. So we've got cases where the person was investigated, they went to court-martial, got found not guilty, they're still titled for 40 years, which to your listeners, that means they still have a criminal record for 40 years. We have a young man now. He went to court-martial in 2019, was found not guilty of all charges, was honorably discharged. He goes to college and graduates. He applies to 64, 65 jobs. 0 interviews. He looks into it. Hey, I'm qualified. I'm overqualified. Hey, we looked at your record and we saw it. He's titled. And so we're trying to get that removed. The last statistics I saw was from like August of 2023. Less than 9% of the people who asked to be removed from titling were allowed to be. So I want you to think about it. That's over and above, right? And even if you go through an administrative process in the military, let's say you don't even go to the court process, a chapter 10 where they discharge you, or you go to a non-judicial punishment, you still get title for 40 years. So to your listeners, what does that mean? That means you can't join law enforcement. You can't buy firearms. You can't be in a gun shop. You can't be teachers, anything that works with children. You can't sponsor a spouse who lives overseas for citizenship. No adoption, things like that for 40 years, even though you never went to court, you were never convicted. That's what titling does. And I guarantee most of your listeners have no idea about that until we just shared that.
Mm-mm. I think hearing so many of other scenarios, especially when it comes to soldiers and military members, my brain always flips to the person that has put you in this position. If they get away with it once and they get all of the perks, that's the cause of concern of how many other times are they going to try this because they know it worked that time and I came out on top. I got everything I wanted. And let's see if I can just do this again. That is the cause of concern because that is happening now more often. This is a tool that's been placed in someone's hand to try and use, but it's working in the system that is giving the government the chance that they need to get that win, to get that title, to get that point, so to speak. But it's also giving all the perks to the person that's claiming they're the victim when truly the victim at heart is left on their own for the rest of their life.
Tabitha, a perfect example of what you just said. We had someone who did it not once but twice. She was going to get kicked out of the military because she had fraudulently enlisted, lied about many other things. And so the only way she could save her benefits was she says, "Hey, I was sexually assaulted." So they go and look at the tape. It was in a Target parking lot. And guess what? She wasn't even there. They drop it. They go back 16 or 17 years. And then they convicted the military member. And then, because she was doing good, she did a false valor thing where she put on extra stripes, gave herself an air medal and a bunch of decorations. She gets caught. So one of our members saw her and reported her. And guess what? All they did was quietly pushed her out of that organization, but there was no punishment. So then she filed against someone else and got another settlement. And so you are 100% right that if you don't punish that behavior, then you can't be surprised when it repeats itself.
Mhm. So, to wrap this episode up, because Sam, we never really asked you the first time, what does life look like in your perfect world now, considering all that you've been through? What do you hope happens, and what does life look like for you?
I hate to end this on a pessimistic note, but of course, I hope I win the appeal. But my history is always going to be on Google. The fact that I went through a court martial and that I was sentenced and that I spent time in a federal prison is it's always going to be on Google, and there's just nothing that can be done about that. And like I used to be a teacher, for example, and if I were to win the appeal, I could get my teaching license back, but there's not a school district in the world that's going to hire me if somebody can just Google me and find out that I had those charges against me. Again, I hate to be a pessimist. I tell people it's if somebody like T-bones your car and they tell you they're going to fix it for you, and they will. They'll fix your car for you, but it's always going to be a little bit messed up. Underneath of it, it's like the frame's going to be bent. It's not going to ride exactly the same way. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer, and yeah, I'm just taking it like one day at a time. I just don't know any other way to do it. I really don't. And this might be my last time to talk, so I want to throw this part in too. I just want to make sure that people understand that like everything that the military is doing, they aren't concerned about victims. They're not concerned about women and they're not concerned about children. That's not why they're doing this. They just want convictions because that will look good for them. And I think that's the key point. And what gets lost is that this type of activity hurts real victims. And it makes it harder for real victims to come forward. And just one quick example is that if you talk to somebody who's in the military, male or female, who's been in the military for more than, say, like 2 or 3 years, you won't find one who hasn't either been accused of something or knows somebody who's been accused of something. And so now when somebody does come forward with a true story, their first thought is going to be like, yeah, okay, we've heard this before. This is hurting true victims. And believe me, there are true victims out there who need help. And this is just making it harder for them. And it's only being done so that the military can look like they're taking care of the problem. And so they have numbers of convictions that makes it look like they're doing what the public wants them to do. It's really, it not only hurts the service member, it hurts true victims.
Mhm. Well, Sam, again, I appreciate you coming on not once, but twice. I don't feel like this is the last time we're going to be speaking with
No,
you because we want to follow up on the appeal process. So even if that's we had your story last year, we have you on now this year, even if we hopefully for your sake and well-being, we're not waiting for a year. Hopefully we're able to check in with you sooner rather than later and with very positive news so that you can pick up and continue forward and make yourself happy. Arvis, again, thank you for coming on and being vulnerable as well, because I know even for you, this is opening a wound all over again. You've been through something very similar. And for victims and true victims, every time you talk about this, it's taking you right back to that scenario. It's reopening that wound because you are still healing mentally, emotionally, physically. It affects those and everyone around you. So thank you both for coming on and sharing your story, Sam. And we are definitely going to be checking back in with you and getting an update, hopefully, very soon.
well, thank you very much, Tabitha.
Thank you, Tabitha.